shows that it has been consecrated. In fact, the ceremony of consecration was performed exactly a week before Edward's death, on the 5th of January, 1066. The tapestry depicts his funeral pyre with great care and reverence. Another year has passed and King Edward the Confessor is dead. We see him above lying on his deathbed in an upper room of his palace of Westminster, speaking his last words to Queen Edith, his wife, while a priest and an attendant minister to him. He is laid in state in the great hall below, and then is borne in a solemn funeral procession to the newly built church of St. Peter, which later became the Abbey of Westminster. Harold is offered the crown of England in succession to Edward the Confessor. He stands, axe in hand, looking at the crown, perhaps wondering if he should accept. He does accept, and in so doing breaks his solemn oath to William of Normandy. We see him seated on the throne, crowned and holding the orb and sceptre, which were, as they still are in England, the symbols of monarchy. Beside him stands Archbishop Stigand, proclaiming the new ruler to the people who listen and applaud. We must again remember that the tale told by the tapestry is a history of events seen through Norman eyes. The breaking of a solemn oath was a gross offence against the laws of chivalry, the gravest of sins in the eyes of the Christian Church. To the Normans, to William of Normandy, there could be no extenuation of this, and the tapestry suggests none. Harold was not only forsworn, he had betrayed his friend. That is the grim story, as the tapestry tells it. Moreover, Harold's acceptance of the crown incurred the wrath of the Church for another reason. Archbishop Stigand, who proclaimed him to the people, and may possibly have performed the ceremony of coronation, of this we cannot be sure, had been excommunicated by the Pope, and therefore was not entitled to hold the office of Archbishop. Such was the case which caused powerful forces to be arrayed against Harold, whose defence was that he had taken the oath under duress, being in William's power, and that therefore it was not valid. A strange star appears in the sky. A comet with a fiery tail, and the people gaze at it in terror. An astrologer tells Harold that this is an omen of misfortune. In the border below this scene, we see the ghastly outlines of ships stealing across the sea. Perhaps this was Harold's dream as he lay troubled by the thought of the oath he had broken, and to the doom which might follow the breaking of his oath. So, of course, this star in the sky was Halley's Comet, which can be seen from the Earth at intervals of about 75 years. It would have been clearly visible in the English crown by Harold, and he resolves instantly to seize it by force of arms and to exact retribution for Harold's betrayal. He gives orders for a fleet of ships to be built to carry his army across the Channel, and men at once set to work felling trees for their timbers. William is seated at the council of war with his hand on his hip, and beside him is Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, William's half-brother and principal adviser. It was he who later ordered the making of the tapestry. We are not to suppose that William's decision to invade England was taken as quickly as the picture suggests. Ambassadors were sent to England to remind Harold of his oath and calling upon him to surrender the crown to William. Harold refused. If William believed that Harold had betrayed him, Harold believed no less sincerely that his oath, taken under the threat of force, was not a binding one. He also knew that his surrender of the throne would lead to civil war in England. We must try to understand this conflict in the spirit of the time. These were two honourable men, according to their lights, despite the deadly quarrel that now divided them. The building of the invasion fleet is shown in this image. Craftsmen with axes, adzes and such other tools, as they used in those days, are finishing off the planks and timbers. The vessels are then dragged down from the building yard to the sea. The place where the work was done was probably Dives-sur-Mer, on the Normandy coast, not far from the town of Caen. The building of this great armada within a few months was in itself a very remarkable feat. Some 800 vessels must have been needed to transport William's powerful and well-equipped army. Opposite the loading of the ships, arms and supplies are being carried on board. Hauberks, or suits of mail, ship's tight packed with men and horses. William's ship is towards the front. With a signal lantern at its masthead, and on its stern post a carving of William's son Robert, blowing a horn and carrying a spear with a gun fanon. William sailed from San Valery at the end of September, having moved his armada from Dives 2 or 3 weeks earlier. The wind played a great part in these events, frustrating both commanders. Harold had assembled a powerful fleet off the Isle of Wight, with which he planned to attack William from the sea, while his ships were still being completed, but the wind failed him. Later, William fretted and fumed, waiting for a favourable wind to take him to England, but the delay, as it turned out, was greatly to his advantage, for in the meantime Harold has been forced to send his ships to the Thames to refit. This was one of the reasons why the Norman army was able to land unopposed. There was no resistance to the Norman landing. Harold, with his splendid force of housecarls, reputed to be the finest foot soldiers in Europe, had been obliged to proceed in great haste to the north to encounter a new trouble that had befallen him. Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, had arrived at the mouth of the Humber with a powerful army, accompanied by Tostig, Harold's brother. Their aim was to conquer the kingdom over which Tostig was to rule as the vassal of the Norwegian king. Harold met them at Stamford Bridge, having covered 200 miles by forced marches. He defeated them after a hard battle, but only at the cost of heavy losses. William's army landed in the south while this was going on. No doubt Harold Hardrada and Tostig took advantage of the threat of a Norman invasion to attack when they did, but there was no alliance between them and William. William's armada lands on the English coast at Pevensey in Sussex. The vessels are beached, the masts unshipped, and men and horses come ashore. Mounted men set out to scour the countryside for possible enemies and for supplies. And here, the Normans, spreading eastwards along the coast, pillage the countryside for food. They round up sheep, cows, and pack horses. The knight, Woddard, to the right of the picture, was evidently a person of importance, since his name appears above him on the tapestry, Hic est Woddard. But although there are many theories, we know nothing positive about him. The Norman cooks are here preparing a feast for William and his high officers to celebrate the army's successful landing. It seems that the cooking was done in the open air. On the left of the picture, we see 2 cooks boiling meat in a big pot, suspended over a fire on forked poles. Above is a row of chickens on spits. Next is a baker standing by his oven and using a large pair of tongs. festive board. It was probably a round table, but its shape has been altered so as to fit in the figure of the serving man bearing a great dish in the foreground. The central figure at the table is Bishop Odo, who seems to be blessing the feast, although no one is paying much attention to him except William, seated on the right. 3 of the noble lords have already started their meal, and a 4th is apparently drawing their attention to something. On the right of the picture, William is conferring with 2 of his leading advisers, Bishop Odo on his right, and Robert Mortain, who was also his half-brother. Orders have been given for a fortress to be built, and we see this on the right of the picture. It was probably a wooden stockade on a mound surrounded by a deep ditch with a number of watchtowers where lookouts and archers could be posted. The workers all appear to be Normans, although one might have expected English peasants to be rounded up to do the digging and carrying. The Normans, for the most part, are working hard under the supervision of their officers, but discipline seems to have been a little lax, since 2 of the men are fighting. This was probably an important episode at the time, but we do not know what it was about. On the left of the picture is William receiving an urgent report from one of the scouts who have been sent out to keep watch for Harold. Then we see the Normans burning a house and forcing a mother and child to flee from their home. Next comes a tall building, which represents the town of Hastings, with its great door open for the Normans to sally forth. Lastly, on the opposite page, we see William making ready to lead his army into battle. A groom brings up his charger. This series of short scenes is like a quick sequence on a cinema film. The designer of the tapestry, who was above all things a storyteller, is building up the suspense before the grand battle piece which is to follow. William on the left is for the first time holding the papal banner with its 4 points. This had been consecrated and sent to him by Pope Alexander II, and it is inserted here to show that the expedition had the blessing of the Church. Nothing is now